Some of my thoughts that I'm going to be sharing today, I've actually borrowed from two other preachers. One is Mary Hinkle Shore. She's an ordained minister in the Evangelical Lutheran Church and a former professor of New Testament at Luther Seminary. She lives in Brevard, North Carolina. And the other one is Father Michael K. Marsh, who I've quoted from before. He's an Episcopal priest from Uvalde, Texas. And Reverend Mary Hinkle says this. She starts with a hymn. She says, the Taizé community has put to music words from St. Teresa of Avila. And the English translation is, nothing can trouble, nothing can frighten. I'll try to sing this. It's going to be close to it. It won't be exactly, but it's, nothing can trouble, nothing can frighten. Those that seek God shall never go wanting. Nothing can trouble, nothing can frighten. God alone fills us. Nothing can trouble, nothing can fright. It just repeats. It's a nice round. And this is in reference to a quote in the Psalm 1, the first Psalm, that was quoted, I think, the fifth Sunday in Ordinary Time, a couple Sundays ago. And it talks about the tree that is planted by running streams. Its roots go down into the living water. And so its leaves never fade. And that's the idea in the psalm. What it says is, such is the person who meditates on the Lord's law day and night. If you meditate on the Lord's law day and night, no matter what else is happening around you, you will be sustained. And so she says, like the tree planted beside running waters, we stay connected with God's promises, and so we can never fail to flourish. Now she says the hymn verse describes the reality out of which Jesus speaks in the gospel today. Earlier in this chapter of Luke, Jesus had spoken to those excluded, reviled, defamed on his account. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst. Blessed are those who suffer. And he offered them blessings and encouraged them towards joy. And so now he encourages all who hear him to live out of that same joy, but not just because they are dependent upon the hand of God and God will eventually save them, but it has to do with when people hate us. It has to do when people ask things of us. And we're meant to give in that same joy regardless of what others are doing. And so she says this, she says, if we hear the voice of God, who encourages us to live out of the joy of the knowledge of God's presence, to live out of the constant reminder of the knowledge of God's presence. Nothing can trouble, nothing can frighten. Those that seek God shall never go wanting. Well, then, what will be happening is we will be offering something different to the people, because we're responding to them not simply as humans who may be accosted or ill-treated or put upon, but as people who are tied to God and respond in that way. So we then respond to things with love and mercy and nonviolence and generosity and forgiveness. And Jesus knows how different the ethic is that he commends from that which is widely acceptable. He says, if you love those who love you, what credit is there to you? Even sinners love those who love them. And the implication is that anyone can love those who love them. Anyone can lend to someone from whom they expect repayment. That kind of love and lending is a transaction. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. And she says a closer look at such transaction-based behavior reveals the problem. In such a world, what you do dictates what I do. In such a world that's transactional, what you do to me dictates what I do to you. So he says, when we return hate with hate, the original hate has won. It inspires and directs our actions. It says, according to Christ, this is not to be. In the reign of God, what we live in What we do is not directed by what others do to us. In the reign of God, what we do is a response to the God who alone fills us. Nothing can trouble, nothing can frighten. Those that seek God shall never go wanting. Nothing can trouble, nothing can frighten. God alone fills us. And so she says this, we need to take note. First, Jesus is speaking to all of those who are listening to him. He speaks throughout the sermon. This is called, you've heard the Sermon on the Mount, which the Beatitudes. Well, this is called the Sermon on the Plain because Jesus came down to a level place and he's talking to everybody. And he adds just not the blessings, but he also adds the admonitions. He says, the great majority of the Sermon on the Plain, including its exhortations to love enemies and show mercy like those of the Most High, is spoken to the community of those listening to Jesus. It's not addressed simply to individuals, it's addressed to the community of those listening to Jesus. And now this is important. She says, this ethic of not returning hate for hate and of going beyond to someone who asks you to go 1 mile, go 2, who asks for your cloak, give them your garment as well. You know, who, if you lend to those who ask. He says this ethic is not to be tried alone. The text is not a directive, for instance, to an individual. As she uses the example, it's not a directive to an individual suffering spousal abuse to bear up under it, while the rest of the Christian congregation looks the other way. It's not, we can't do this on our own. We can only do it as a community. She says, in the reign of God, then, we live and act in communion, which means bluntly that we concern ourselves with each other's business more than the transaction ethic might suggest we should. Transaction ethic is, you do something for me, I will do something for you. You do something against me, I will get back at you. And when Jesus famously one time said, you've heard it said an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And of course, that was meant to be something that was somewhat ameliorating. We just had the Old Testament, where, God has delivered Saul into David's hands, and instead of just nailing him to the spot with the spear, he lets him live because he's the anointed. And the idea is that if we live with the law of talent, eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth was meant to be, if somebody hits you in the face, you don't simply, kill them. Eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. It was supposed to be something that was kind of equaling things out, so you wouldn't get too carried away. But the problem is, if that's the way we live, then you wind up with a world full of toothless and blind people. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Toothless and blind people in the whole world. So in the reign of God, we live and act in community. And Pastor Hinkle says the goal of such groups, community of those living in God's reign, is to support one another in Christian life and witness. The lifestyle commended by Jesus in the sermon is lived out with the support of such a group. And she then says the second point to be made is that Jesus offers his ethic as a way for the community of his followers to resist the tit for tat of the present age and not to be passive in the face of it. She says, when we live the ethic of this sermon in the face of the world's violence, when we live the ethic of this sermon in the face of the world's violence, we are collectively saying to those who hate, abuse, strike, judge, and condemn, you are not the boss of me. We are demonstrating that bad behavior cannot goad us into reacting in kind. We are resisting the evils we deplore. In other words, we have a choice. That's where Father Michael Marsh comes in. He says, every day, you and I make one or two choices. We either choose to be large, or we choose to be small. And what we choose affects others. If we choose to be small, we will keep score. We will act with violence. We will seek retribution. We will make our relationships conditioned on who the other is and what he or she does for me. And that's not people who live in the reign of God. He says if we choose to be large rather than small in our actions, it says it will be in recognition that something other than security, protection, power, reciprocity, and balancing the books is seeking our attention and animating our life. It says if we choose to go large, it will call us to be less fearful, less suspicious, less anxious, and less needy. It changes our attitudes towards others. It creates space for others. It's no longer us versus them, it's all of us together. And he says this, which is something that I have to remember and remind myself again and again. He adds a note, Father Marsh adds a note about personal pain. One of the things that is obvious is that we have no idea what's going on in the life of somebody else unless they tell us. When you're sitting in traffic and you see a car go by, you have no idea what is happening in that person's life, do you? Unless you know them and say, oh, that's so-and-so. You know, they're completely unknown to us. When you pass a bus, there's all these people on that bus, all intent on whatever it is that's happening in their life that day, coming to and from work, going in and out of the hospital, picking up children, visiting sick people, and we have no idea what's happening in their life. And if we did, it would probably help us to be compassionate and understanding. And our reaction to them then would be not as one of a stranger out of fear, what do you want? It would be we would understand what is happening in their life, and then we would say something similar to, can I help? Can I help? He says this, everyone has a story of pain hidden behind the life that she or he shows to the world. I never really know what's going on in the life of another. And he says maybe that's why Jesus tells us not to judge or condemn, but be forgiving. He says maybe that's why we are not to return violence for violence, because we don't really know the other story. He says the not knowing is why we must continue to hold attention, pay attention to our behavior, and choose to act largely, not smallly. And he says you and I may not be able to diminish or take away the pain of the world. You or I may not be able to diminish or take away the pain of the whole world, but neither do we have to add to it. He says, and he has this question, are you and I adding to the pain of the world, to the life of another person? Are you and I adding to the pain of the world, to the life of another person? He says, chances are there's someone in each of our lives who is hanging on by a thread. Sometimes we know they're hanging on by a thread, other times we don't. But he says they're in need of love, mercy, and forgiveness. They're in need of a warm cloak. You know, they're in need of a companion to walk a mile with them. They're in need of someone to give to them even if they know that they cannot pay them back. They need forgiveness and mercy, prayer and a blessing, compassion, generosity, the benefit of the doubt, an open heart, and open hands. And he says, we all know what that's like, to be in that kind of need. We've all been there. And then he says this, and I think this is wonderful with regard to what Jesus is saying in the gospel today. Many people say, we can't do that. That's asking too much. We can't do that. Turn the other cheek, give to those who ask for us to borrow money from them, for them to borrow money from us. You know, hate your enemies. But what he says is this. We all know people that are hanging by a thread. Let's not be the scissors that cuts their thread. And that's the reason why this kind of action is not only possible, but desirable. Because we change it from what is it they're taking from us to what is it that they need. And am I in a position to give that? And if nothing can trouble, nothing can frighten, those that seek God shall never go wanting. Nothing can trouble, nothing can frighten, God alone fills us. If we are like that tree planted by the living stream, in other words, if we stay close to God, then we will find that not only is the desire to alleviate suffering, something that we see as godly, it also is something that we see as humanly possible to do. Amen?